Okay, we are back here today with book four of Plato's Republic. Tons and tons of cool stuff happens in this book. We finished our discussion of book three. Just as a quick reminder, we finished our discussion. Uh, oh, shoot, it's not what I want. Um, with this final division of the city, right? So we get to the end of book three and we learn that the city has three parts to it. It has the guardian class who rules the city. It has the auxiliary class who sort of protects the city, right? So this is the warrior class. And then it has the economic class or the commoners. And so the last thing that happens in book three is we see what was the guardian class. We see it split into two classes, the rulers and the common soldiers. So now we've got this nice clean division of three classes. And of course, Plato wants to sort of solidify or consolidate public support for these three classes or for people's place in these three classes. And he does that through that myth of the metals, the noble lie that makes sure that everyone plays their part. All right. So this gets us into book four. Book four has some preliminary discussions about the rulers. So if you read the last two or three pages of book three closely, after he finishes this discussion of who's going to rule, there's this brief discussion of the kinds of conditions, the kinds of living conditions that the rulers, the new guardian class, will be subject to. And what's remarkable about it is that um, uh, Socrates is pretty clear that he's extremely wary of them having any kind of economic interests whatsoever. So they're not going to have professions, right? So there'll be guardians and nothing else. They won't have occupation. They won't have any great amount of money. They won't own property. In fact, they'll live essentially a totally public life. And what I mean by that is like so we can imagine a public-private distinction that just emphasizes that when we're at home, we do the things that concern us. So we take care of our families and we manage our money and we have our own sort of private hobbies and private pursuits, right? So, whatever we're into, we tend to do those sorts of things at home, right? And this is our own private life. And when we go to work, we're kind of we behave in a different way, but we keep this sort of public and private self as distinct as we can. Well, Plato actually sees that as a problem for the guardians. So remember that the guardians, the thing that they will need the most, the thing that will qualify them to rule, is this kind of deep and abiding and almost absolute love for the city that they have. And so he's extremely wary of them having any kind of private matters that might pull them away from a love of the city. And the very first kind of private matter that he's worried about is economic, right? So if they have a lot of money, if they have a lot of land, if they have any going business interests, these are always going to sort of pull them away from their pure love for the city. It's always going to give them a potential conflict with their love of the city. Now, as we'll see later, this is going to be extended into these other things that we talked about in the private sphere as well. So things like the family, right? We don't want them worrying about their own kids and their own kids' success over and against the success of the city. But we'll see that more in book five. So at the end of book three, what we see is that the Guardian's life is really a very sort of Spartan existence. They don't have much in terms of goods. They don't have any wealth. They don't have any occupations. They don't really have a private life. They live very much publicly. And again, the idea is that we want them to love the city as much as we can. And so Adeimantus jumps into the at the beginning of book 40. He's like, listen, who would want to live like this? Part of the reason that you want to rule, part of the reason you want to be in charge is because there are certain benefits that come with ruling. Part of the reason you want to have great political power is that there are certain benefits that come from political power, right? We want to get on top because presumably, sure, we want to rule in the interest of all, but we also kind of want to get a slice of that for ourselves. And so it's like, why would you have this guardian class? Why would you have this ruling class and make them live in this way? And Socrates very quickly points out that, right, what we're building here is a kind of ideal city, this city in speech, and that ideally our rulers ought not to have any conflicts with their love of the city. And so this conversation kind of goes on for a while, but I'm going to skip over most of it because there's so much action in the middle and late parts of this book, and that action is what I want to turn to now. So by the end of this first sort of 5 or 6 page part of book four, we get to what Socrates considers to be the conclusion of the construction of the city. So if we turn here, I'm on page 105. This is at Stephanos pagination 427D. So here's what Socrates says. So then, son of Ariston, I said, your city would now be founded. And the next place, get yourself an adequate light somewhere. Notice the return to this metaphor of seeing. Not just seeing, but also there's also this kind of recurring motif of like light. So one thing that is sort of clear about the action of the Republic is that it starts at night. So he's down at the Piraeus. He's watching these religious festivals. It's late in the evening. He's taken to the house of Cephalus and he's subjected to this long conversation, presumably all 10 books of the Republic. This is one long conversation that takes place over the course of an evening. So there's like the sense that the action of the Republic takes place over the course of an evening, and then it ends with dawn, right? It ends with the coming of day and light sort of shining and stuff. So there's these constant motifs of like get a light and let's search for something. Let's retrain our eyes to be able to see this thing. Calling your brother and Polemarchus and the others, whether we can somehow see where the justice might be and where the injustice, and what they differ from one another, and which the man who's going to be happy must possess, whether it escapes the notice of all gods and humans or not. You're talking nonsense, said Glaucon. You promised you would look for it because it's not holy for you not to bring help to justice in every way and your power, etc., etc. He says, now then, I hope I'll find it in this way. So he kind of proposes to look for justice in this kind of odd way. I suppose our city, if that is, it has been correctly founded, is perfectly good. Necessarily, he said. Plainly, then, it's wise, courageous, moderate, and just. So this is kind of odd. This is a sort of ancient Greek variation on the, what you might know is the sort of Christian cardinal virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And the basic idea is like, if we know it to be the case that all things which are perfectly good are wise, have courage, are moderate, and are just. And so, in other words, the very nature of goodness implies these characteristics as well. Then let's do this. Let's find wisdom, courage, moderation in the city. And there's a sense in which sort of whatever's left over, we can have a sense is what we mean by justice. Isn't it the case that whichever then we happen to find will leave as the remainder what hasn't been found? Of course. Therefore, just as with any four things, if we were seeking any one of them in something or other and recognize it first, that would be enough for us. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's start looking for these four things. So first we find wisdom. And Socrates tells us that this perfect city, is wise. In what way is it wise? Well, he says this at the top of 106. With these things too, since they happen to be four, mustn't we look for them in the same way? Plainly, well, it's wisdom, in my opinion, which first comes plainly to light in it, and something about it looks strange. What, he said, the city we described is really wise, in my opinion. That's because it's of good counsel, isn't it? So the city is wise, and how is the city wise? It's wise in that it is, in his phrase here, of good counsel. Now, what does this mean? Well, if we look a little bit further down on the page, we see the following. In the city, so this I'm at 428 D, is there in the city we just founded a kind of knowledge belonging to some of the citizens that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular thing in the city, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities. There is indeed what and in whom is it? I said it's the guardian skill, and it's in those rulers whom we just now named perfect guardians. So he sort of lays this out like governing is like any other sort of activity. It's an activity in the sense that it will be led by a certain kind of knowledge, right? So if we're thinking about carpentry, we want our craft when we're out doing carpentry, we want that activity to be led by a certain kind of knowledge. Now, the kind of knowledge that leads carpentry is not the knowledge of horse breaking, and it's not the knowledge of video game playing. It's the knowledge of carpentry. So, provided we're undertaking carpentry according to the knowledge that belongs to the craft of carpentry, we would say that our craft is guided by good counsel, by the appropriate counsel. So, in this case, what makes the city wise is that there is a particular kind of knowledge, knowledge of the whole city, not knowledge of money making, not knowledge of how to fill out forms correctly, not knowledge of carpentry, right? None of these things qualify the rulers to rule. What qualifies the rulers to rule is a specific kind of knowledge, namely knowledge about the city, about the health of the entire city. And it turns out that we have a class of people in the city that does nothing else except focus on accumulating and acting on this knowledge. And that class of people, the class of people whose purpose is just full and total dedication to the knowledge of the city, is the guardian class. So, what makes the city wise is the fact that the city has in it this class of people, and that the city is guided by, is counseled by this class of people. So top of 107, 428 E to 429A. It is therefore from the smallest group and part of itself, and the knowledge in it, from the supervising and ruling part, that a city founded according to nature would be wise as a whole. And this class, which properly has a share in that knowledge, which alone among the various kinds of knowledge ought to be called wisdom, has, as it seems, the fewest members by nature. Right? So this elite class will have a particular kind of knowledge, and it's that particular kind of knowledge, namely knowledge of the entire city, that qualifies it to rule. And he notes that this will necessarily be the smallest class of people. And this goes, by the way, this goes for any kind of knowledge, right? So even something like carpentry, right? So we think about carpentry as being a kind of working class profession, whatever. And I mean, that's sort of true, but it's also extremely not true, right? There are only some people who are qualified to be carpenters. If you needed a carpentry job done, the last thing you want to do is just ask anyone off the street how to do it. You want to ask someone with a particular kind of knowledge, namely the specialized knowledge in carpentry. So the number of people who are qualified to engage in carpentry is a relatively small number of people. In fact, it's a very small number of people. Likewise with the um, elites in this case. So we live in America and a liberal Western democracy. We have certain views about who's qualified to rule. We think that the people ought to rule. We think the government should be for, of, and by the people. The Greeks did not think this. Even though we think about Athens as being the first democracy, it was not democracy in anything like the kind of universal suffrage, egalitarian sense of democracy that we mean now. Socrates, in particular, was extremely skeptical of the wisdom of the masses. And in fact, never forget, Socrates was in fact straightforwardly murdered by the masses for holding views that they didn't like. So the city will be wise if there is this small group dedicated to identifying, accumulating, and acting upon knowledge of the health of the city. And if that class of people is in position to counsel the city overall. All right, so the city is wise. Why? Because it has this guardian class. And because the guardian class is distinguished according to this type of knowledge. On to the next thing, courage. So what is courage? Courage turns out to be something kind of odd here. So he discusses it. This is at 429C. So a city is also courageous by a part of itself, thanks to that part's having having in it a power that through everything will preserve the opinion about which things are terrible, that they are the same ones and of the same sort as those the lawgiver transmitted in the education. Or don't you call that courage? I don't quite understand what you said, he said. Say it again. So, like Glaucon, I don't understand what he says either. Courage means preserving the opinion about which things are terrible. It's kind of odd. I mean, I said that courage is a certain kind of preserving. Just what sort of preserving? The preserving of the opinion produced by law through education about what and what sort of thing is terrible. And by preserving through everything, I meant preserving that opinion and not casting it out in pains and pleasures and desires and fears. If you wish, I'm willing to compare it to what I think it's like, but I do wish. So this is interesting. It gets into this discussion of dying wool. So essentially, it's Plato's idea of courage is that courage is about sort of maintaining and, in a sense, enforcing those standards, those ideas about good and bad, about lawful and unlawful, about justice and injustice that come from the guardian class, right? So we're educated in a particular tradition, we're educated in a certain set of rules, a certain morality, and courage is about sticking to that morality, about making sure that that morality, that way of being, whatever you want to call it, that education is preserved, is carried through, is enacted. So courage isn't just risking your life, because after all, we can risk our lives for stupid things, right? You can act, you can drive negligently, for example, and you can text while driving, and just out of sheer laziness and lack of discipline, you can essentially risk your life. But no one would call that courage, right? You can also risk your life over extremely stupid things, extremely evil things, right? So you can fly planes into the World Trade Center. You can make outrageous bets like, you're going to bet on the number of blades of grass in your front yard. And if you fail that bet, you'll kill yourself. You can do all kinds of things to risk your life that we wouldn't call courageous. So courage isn't just about risking your life. It's about, Socrates thinks it's about preserving the education, or preserving those ideas about good and evil that are transmitted to you through the education provided by the guardian class. So, is this city courageous? Yes, because it has this second class, the auxiliary class, whose, again, their name is auxiliary, they help. So, they take those standards of right and wrong, of justice and injustice that come from the guardian class, that come from that source of good counsel, and they preserve those things, right? So they attack enemies when need be. They maintain law and order inside the city when need be, right? But they make sure that the education, that the ideas of right and wrong, that the guardians deem correct or just or whatever, they make sure that these are preserved. So that's the sense in which the city is. It has this thing, courage. What about moderation? Depending on your translation of the Republic, this can sometimes be translated as temperance. So is the city moderate, or does it have temperance? Here's what he says about moderation. Well, no, I said there are still two left that must be seen in the city: moderation, and that for the sake of which we are making the whole search justice. Most certainly, here I'm on the bottom of 108. How could we find justice so we won't have to bother about moderation any further? I, for my part, don't know. Actually, we can skip this. Uh, Here's what he says at the top of 109 about moderation. It must be considered, I said, seen from here, it, i.e., moderation, is more like a kind of accord and harmony than the previous ones. How? Moderation, I said, is surely a certain kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires, as men say when they use, I don't know in what way, the phrase stronger than himself, and some other phrases of the sort are used that are, as it were, its tracks. Isn't that so? So this is kind of odd. He's thinking about moderation. And actually, I think it's useful to use the word temperance here. So he's thinking about temperance in this way. If we think about the temperance movement in America was about alcohol, right? So the temperance movement was that movement that saw its greatest political victory in prohibition, the constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol. So temperance then is tied to not drinking, which is to say, in another way, that when we drink, we act intemperately. So if we think about what happens to us when we drink, we, in a sense, we lose what some people refer to as our inhibitions, where we become less inhibited. We are more likely to act in unusual or sort of spontaneous or almost like instinctual. We're more likely to act compulsively. And what we mean is like that second voice in your head that tells you, probably not a good idea to start a fight in this bar, or probably not a good idea to call your ex-boyfriend at 3 o'clock in the morning, or probably not a good idea to have that ninth shot or whatever. Like that voice, when we drink, that voice gets quieter and quieter and quieter until it disappears altogether. What that voice is, Socrates wants to say, that voice is your way of, in the phrase that he uses here on page 109, it's your way of mastering yourself, right? So there is this odd sense in which what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we behave, when we conduct ourselves, that the more rational, that the more calculating, that the more moderate voices in our head win out. And so we say that someone is in control of themselves if they can control their compulsions, if they can control their sort of spontaneous desires, if they can subject their short-term whims to longer-term plans, right? This is someone who has mastered themselves. And this, he thinks, this is what moderation is. It's a kind of harmony, a kind of accord between the different parts of ourselves. And so he thinks the city is moderate, not so there's a tendency here to say, well, wisdom's found in the guardians and courage is found in the auxiliaries. So clearly moderation is found in the common class. That's actually not true. Moderation is more to do with the relation between the classes. So if all three classes recognize that we ought to be led by, we ought to be counseled by that part of the city which is best suited for it. And if the three parts of the city recognize that ultimately the commoners, right, the economic classes, shouldn't be in the position to preserve things, they shouldn't be in the position to rule, then that is a moderate person, or a moderate city, I should say. An immoderate person is someone who is led by the wrong part of their um, the wrong part of their personality, right? Someone for whom there's a lot of internal discord, internal disharmony between the different parts of themselves. That's what he thinks it means to be immoderate, and that's what an immoderate city is. He says this on 110. You see, we've divined pretty accurately a while ago that moderation is like a kind of harmony. Why so? Because it's unlike courage and wisdom, each of which resides in a part, the one making the city wise and the other courageous. Moderation doesn't work that way, but actually stretches throughout the whole, from top to bottom of the entire scale, making the weaker, the stronger, and those in the middle, whether you wish to view them as such in terms of prudence, or if you wish in terms of strength or multitude, money, or anything else whatsoever of the sort, sing the same chant together. So we would rightly claim that this unanimity is moderation, an accord of worse and better according to nature as to which must rule in the city and in each one. So when the commoners realize that the wise ought to rule, that is a moderate city. Okay. And what about justice? So they do this weird routine here on 111. Right, they're still looking for it. This place is very dark. He says it's steeped in shadows, and we're still looking for justice. And there's like this weird here. This is 432D, and I caught sight of it, i.e., justice. And I said, "Here, Glaucon. Maybe we've come upon a track." And in my opinion, I will hardly get away from us. That's good news, you report. He said, My. I said that was a stupid state we were in. How's that? And so here's where we finally see justice. And this relates back to the discussion we had yesterday about the first iteration of the city. It appears, you blessed man, that it's been rolling around at our feet from the beginning. And we couldn't see it after all, but we're quite ridiculous. As men holding something in their hands sometimes seek what they're holding, we too didn't look at it, but turned our gaze somewhere far off, which is also perhaps just the reason it escaped our notice. So Socrates is suggesting that the idea of justice, the form of justice, that what they've been searching for with respect to justice has been here the whole time. It's been lying at their feet the whole time. Um, and so here we are, 433a. Listen whether, after all, I make any sense. That rule we set down at the beginning, so this is the first iteration of the city, as to what must be done in everything when we were founding the city. This or a certain form of it is, in my opinion, justice. Surely we set down and often said, if you remember, that each one must practice one of the functions in the city, that one for which his nature made him naturally most fit. Yes, we were saying that. And further, that justice is the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody. This we have both heard from many others and have often said ourselves. Yes, we have. Well, then, my friend, I said, the practice of minding one's own business, when it comes into being in a certain way, is probably justice. Okay. So this is kind of wild. So what is justice? Justice, it turns out, was in that first iteration of the city. It was in the fact that each person specialized in that which was best suited for their nature. And not only did they specialize in that thing, but on top of that, they also only did that one thing, right? So one man, one job. That was the principle that we got out of the first iteration of the city. And it turns out that in a slightly more sophisticated and complicated way, that's also the principle of justice that we find in the second iteration of the city. that justice is about one man, one job. So the city is just. And why is the city just? The city is just because that which is best suited for each job does each job. So those who are best suited to guide the city, those who are best suited to provide counsel for the city, namely those best citizens who have a spirited soul and who love the city best of all, they rule, right? Those who also have a spirited soul, but who love the city perhaps slightly less, right? They help, they're the auxiliaries. And those who do not have spirited natures, those who are mainly interested in profit and loss and in being comfortable, right? Those who are mainly interested in satisfying their appetites and being happy and content, they don't either rule or help. They just do their job, right? They go to work every day and they come home and they are ruled by their superiors. So the city is just in that it is ordered in the proper fashion, right? That's what makes the city just. And that sort of concludes the second iteration of the city, and it concludes Plato's investigation of the second iteration of the city. Now we have to remember that this discussion of the city is itself only undertaken as a way of illustrating more clearly justice in the soul. So now at the end of book four, he zooms back into the individual and he wants to say, okay, so we have this idea of justice in the city, justice, not only justice, but also the other four virtues, the other three virtues that we identified, wisdom, courage, and moderation. Now let's take a look at them in the individual. So he begins this discussion on 114 at 435c. Then it's in this way, my friend, that will claim that the single man with the same forms in his soul, thanks to the same affections as those in the city, rightly lays claims to those same names. Quite necessarily, he said. Now it's a slight question about the soul we've stumbled upon, you surprising man. Does it have these forms in it or not? Now, Plato's problem here is an interesting one. So he was able to identify the four virtues by building the city and by splitting the city into this tripartite formation, right? So we were able to see what the virtues were, and we were able to identify them by assigning them in some way or by seeing how they emerge from the division of the city into three parts. But what about the soul? Does the soul have three parts? This is an open question. And it's not at all clear. And so he actually spends a number of pages. This is a surprisingly long discussion, um, trying to determine as clearly as possible what thirst is. And so he does a kind of conceptual analysis of the idea of thirst. And what he does with thirst, what he ends up saying is that thirst is an example of what he calls an appetite. And what he wants to really insist is that appetites are relatively simple, i.e., relatively straightforward and unidirectional things. And so thirst is an example. Thirst, he says, when we're thirsty, thirst doesn't really care for quality and it doesn't really care for sort of long-term plans, right? When we're thirsty, when we're really thirsty, when we're like parched, we don't really care what we drink. We just know that we must drink, right? This he thinks is the truest form of thirst. And so the appetite, it has one object, namely drink, right? It only has one way of satisfying it, namely by drinking. And so appetite in this case is an extremely simple thing. It's not quite an instinct, but it's a sort of a yearning. It's a voice within our the word he uses over and over again here, soul. The Greek soul looks like psyche or psyche. So we can kind of skip all the sort of religious questions about the word soul and just think about like the psyche or the mind or consciousness. So inside our consciousness, there are from time to time these kind of brute appetites that we hear. And when we're extremely thirsty, right, you can imagine a case in which you were extremely thirsty and you were almost unable to think about anything else except how thirsty you were. Sometimes or if you're so hungry that you have a hard time thinking about other things, you might say that you're hangry or whatever, right? So these appetites can speak increasingly loudly, but our consciousness, right? There's always these voices, and these voices include some things which are extremely simple, and we just call them appetites. He spends a ton of time. establishing that this is the case. And he wants to establish this is the case because he wants to say there must be at least two different voices in the head. There must be, on the one hand, appetites, these kind of brute, simple voices that say, give me something to drink. And then there's at least another second voice which says, well, I want this to drink rather than that to drink. Or I've had too much to drink. Or if I drink too much, I'll get sick. Or I want to balance this drink with this food or something like that. Right? Likewise with hunger. Right? There's a part of us that just says, I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse, I could eat anything. I just want pizza, I just want something, and I want it quick. And there's another voice that says, well, you're on a diet right now, and so you need to do this. Or there's another voice that says, well, you're on hunger strike right now, and so you can't eat. And so we can, in other words, there's a very intuitive sense in which everyone can grasp this very simple thing, an appetite. And we can simultaneously grasp that there's a second voice that can speak against this appetite, or that can channel this appetite, or can do any number of things to this appetite. And so he says at the beginning, there are at least two voices. There are appetites, which he says are by definition not logical. He calls them alogistikon. The word, the preface a or ana in Greek always just means not. Right, so there's at least two voices, the appetites, which are not rational. And there's this second voice, which he calls reason, and which we will know as logos. Um, So the simplest statement of this comes here on 118 at 439b. Therefore, the soul of the man who's thirsty, insofar as it thirsts, wishes nothing other than to drink, and strives for this and is impelled toward it plainly. If ever something draws it back when it's thirsting, wouldn't that be something different in it from that which thirsts and leads it like a beast to drink? For of course we say the same thing wouldn't perform opposed actions concerning the same thing with the same part of itself at the same time. So we have one voice that tells us to drink and one voice that qualifies that or rejects that or that channels it or whatever. Fair enough. So we turn to 119. Um, uh, this is at 439d. So we won't be irrational, I said, if we claim they are two and different from each other, naming the part of the soul with which it calculates, the calculating, and the part with which it loves, hungers, thirsts, and is agitated by the other desires, the irrational and desiring companion of certain replenishments and pleasures. So we have that part, he says, which calculates, and that part which loves, hungers, thirsts, et cetera, which he calls irrational. That calculating part, we could say, is the rational part. No, we won't, he said. It would be fitting for us to believe that. Therefore, I said, let these two forms in the soul be distinguished. Now, is the part that contains spirit and with which we are spirited a third, or would it have the same nature as one of these others? Perhaps he said the same as one of them, the desiring. But I said, I once heard something that I trust. This is a good story here. Leontius, the son of Aglaon, was coming up from the Piraeus onto the outside of the north wall when he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner. He desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted and made himself turn away, and for a while he struggled and covered his face. Finally, overpowered by the desire, he opened his eyes wide, ran toward the corpses, and said, Look, you damned wretches, take your fill of the fair sight. I too have heard it, he said. This speech, I said, certainly indicates that anger sometimes make war against the desire as one thing against something else. So there appears to be a third part of the soul. He sometimes calls it anger. Um, the word that he uses here, the translator Bloom uses here, is spirit. And of course, we've already seen that this spirit, this word is thumos. So we have now a tripartite soul. In this tripartite soul, he thinks so. In other words, he says there are three classes in the soul, and these three classes ought to mirror in some important way the three classes of the city. Now, actually, I have them upside down compared to this up here, but you get the basic idea. So there should be um, a tripartite soul with the smallest part, logos, on top, the helper part, thumos, in the middle, and a logistikon, the irrational part of the soul, or the appetites on the bottom. Okay, so can we find the virtues in these parts of the soul? And it turns out that, of course, we can. So if we look on page 121 at 441E or 442, isn't it proper for the calculating part to rule, since it is wise and has forethought about all of the soul, and for the spirited part to be obedient to it and its ally? Certainly. So as we were saying, won't a mixture of music and gymnastic make them accordant, tightening the one and training it in fair speeches and learning, while relaxing the other two with soothing tales, taming it by harmony and rhythm? This actually, this talk about music and gymnastic, this is from book three, where he spends a lot of time talking about the proper education of the guardian. So music and gymnastics are ways of disciplining the various parts of the soul. And what he means by that is making sure that the appetites know that they ought to be led by the reason, the logos. Quite so, he said. And these two, thus trained and having truly learned their own business and been educated, will be set over the desiring, which is surely most of the soul in each, and by nature most insatiable for money, and they'll watch it for fear of its being filled with the so-called pleasures of the body, and thus becoming big and strong, and then not minding its own business, but attempting to enslave and rule what is not appropriately ruled by its class, and subverting everyone's entire life. So notice the commentary here. In the same way that those who truly know about a subject, those who are in a position to provide good counsel on a particular activity, right? Those who know carpentry when it comes to the activity of carpentry, those who know the city when it comes to the activity of ruling, they will by necessity be the smallest part, and the commoners will by definition be the biggest part. Well, likewise with the soul, we are always beset by desires, all sorts of desires, not just thirst and hunger, but the desire for indolence and the desire to laze around and the desire to sleep and the desire to just take what we want, right? We're besieged by desires which are common and many and which always want their way. And we have to be trained in such a way as to rule over these desires with our reason, in the same way that the good and moderate city will be ruled over, the common classes will be ruled over by the reason, or sorry, by the guardian class. Most certainly, he said. So I said, wouldn't these two do the finest job of guarding against enemies from without on behalf of all of the soul and the body, the one deliberating, the other making war, following the ruler, and with its courage fulfilling what has been decided? Yes, that's so. And then I suppose we call a single man courageous because of that part, when his spirited part preserves through pains and pleasures what has been proclaimed by the speeches about that which is terrible and that which is not correct. A little bit further down. And what about this? Isn't he moderate because of the friendship and accord of these parts? When the ruling part and the two ruled parts are of a single opinion that the calculating part ought to rule and don't raise faction against it. Moderation surely is nothing other than this in city or in private man. Right, so what makes a person wise? What makes a person wise is that he has this fully developed top part, right? This fully developed reason, and that his reason recommends to the other parts of his soul what ought to be done and not ought to be done. What makes a person courageous? Courage comes in the preserving of what our reason tells us. And so if we have, through our reason, decided that supporting our family is good, or that working hard at work is good, or whatever it is that we've decided that doing is worth doing, right? Then this courageous part becomes a kind of discipline. Right? We are going to preserve this view of what's good and bad. We are going to enforce this view of what's good and bad. And we're going to do these things. We're going to be led by our reason, and we're going to be supported by our courage over and against our desires, over and against our common appetites. And the moderate person is one who is mastered in this way, one who is ruled in this way, one whose appetites are properly curtailed and properly managed by the two better parts of his soul. So what then is the just man? Well, here's what he says on 123. 443b, isn't the cause of all this that, so far as ruling and being ruled are concerned, each of the parts in him minds its own business? That and nothing else is the cause. Skip a little bit further down. This is at 443d. But in truth, justice was, as it seems, something of this sort. However, not with respect to a man's minding his external business, but but with respect to what is within, with respect to what truly concerns him and his own. He doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. He arranges himself, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts exactly like three notes in a harmonic scale, lowest, highest, and middle. And if there are some other parts in between, he binds them together and becomes entirely one from many, moderate and harmonized. Then and only then he acts, if he does act in some way, either concerning the acquisition of money or the care of the body or something political or concerning private contracts. In all these actions, he believes and names a just and fine action, one that preserves and helps to produce this condition, and wisdom, the knowledge that supervises this action, while he believes and names an unjust action, one that undoes this condition, and lack of learning in its turn, the opinion that supervises this action. So in this case, justice becomes a matter of the proper ordering of the soul. And the next page, he compares it to a kind of health. Right? Justice is like health in that the way that health is a kind of proper ordering of the body, justice is a proper ordering of the mind or the psyche or the soul. Right? So if you give over to that rational part of your soul, the business of ruling, and if you give over to the spirited part of your soul, the thumos, the business of preserving what reason tells us, and if you make sure that all three parts are in harmony with one another, each part does only that part that it's suited to do, right? Then you will be just. So if you let the appetites rule you, you're an unjust person. Right? That's the nature, he says, of injustice. So that ends book four. So we've seen what the just city is and then what justice consists in the city. And then we've zoomed back in and also seen what this means in the individual. Now he's going to complicate this in book five. So tomorrow we're going to read book five, and we're going to learn that there's actually a third iteration of the city. And that third iteration of the city comes by re-examining this guardian class and saying a few further things about how this guardian class will be populated and organized. But for now, we can leave it there. As always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Check out office hours or shoot me an email, and we'll talk soon. Bye.